Good afternoon, everybody. Cameron Wood and myself are going to talk about what we've been doing in the southeast in the Kingston Confined Aquifer Management Area. This is an area between Kingston down to just south of Robe in the Lower Limestone Coast Water Allocation Plan. Which way? Okay. So in 2013, the Southeast NRM Board completed the Lower Limestone Coast Water Allocation Plan. It resulted in the volumetric conversion of area-based allocations, and in this area most of the water is being used for flood irrigated areas using artesian water of pasture for stock. There's also some small seed production and those sort of things in that area as well. So the outcome of the plan was that when we did the volumetric conversion, the volume that the formulas gave us ended up with us allocating more water than we expected. We'd used a risk-based assessment framework to look at what the impact of that allocation and the use would be. And we found that in the plan we were missing some vital information to make key decisions. So what we did is taking a risk approach, said we'd limit the amount of use in that area to 25,000 megalitres, even though we'd allocated somewhere over 40,000 megalitres. So the task we had was to look at what would happen with different scenarios of use in that area, and we asked the Science Monitoring and Knowledge Group in Juna to model a couple of different scenarios for us. So Cameron will go through and tell you what we found, and then I'll talk about what we did, what we're going to do next.
This is the science partnership model, like practical demonstration of. So we did some modelling, just a bit of a background to the geology and the hydrogeology. So we're in the southeast. Two main aquifers, the unconfined tertiary limestone aquifer overlying the confined tertiary sand aquifer, which is what we're interested in here. This is a cross-section from roughly Numerical to Kingston. Two things to note here. The dotted line is the groundwater level in the unconfined aquifer, and the solid line is the pressure level in the confined aquifer. So over here, close to the border, this is where Sard was talking. The pressure in the unconfined aquifer is higher than the confined aquifer, so there's that potential for downward leakage that Sard was talking about. As we go out to the west, this shaded or this outlined area here is the Kingston Confined Aquifer Management Area, and the confining aquifer is actually under such pressure that it's artesian. So if you drill a bore into the confined aquifer here, the bore flows freely, which makes it a valuable resource for irrigation because you don't have to pump. The salinity is also quite low, and it's the reason why there's a lot of irrigation concentrated there. So this map shows the location of extraction bores from the confined aquifer. As you can see, a lot of them are concentrated here in the Kingston management area where conditions are artesian. This line here shows the approximate extent of those artesian conditions in the confined aquifer, so where bores are free-flowing. I say approximate, it's based on what observation data we have. These plots here show groundwater pressure trends in the confined aquifer in Kingston. They fluctuate seasonally quite a lot because it's a confined aquifer, and also because there's a lot of seasonal extraction for irrigation here in Kingston. Going backwards, let's go forwards. A few long-term trends. There's a bit of a long-term recovery from in the 1990s to do with rehabilitation of old leaky bores that restored a lot of artesian pressure. So to look at those extraction scenarios and risk assessment stuff that Tim was talking about, we used a 3D numerical groundwater flow model of the confined aquifer. It's based on a model that was developed in 2000 by Keith Brown. We refined it and did a bit more work with it under this project. I won't go into too much detail there. There's a technical report that'll be on WaterConnect and probably also the Southeast NRM Board site that sort of goes into the capabilities and limitations of the model. I could talk forever, but I won't. This plot shows how the model sort of simulates that behaviour of the aquifer. It doesn't match it perfectly everywhere, but it does a pretty good job of simulating those seasonal fluctuations and some of the longer term trends and recoveries here. And over on the right is the model simulated artesian extent of the aquifer. So what this is how far above the ground surface the water in the confined aquifer will come to under artesian pressure. And so, in looking at what's an appropriate target management level for the confined aquifer based on the groundwater model, I guess we were looking at the question, what's an appropriate management target for the confined aquifer? So typically management targets for the aquifers in the southeast are based on maintaining groundwater levels so that groundwater levels don't decline and so that salinity doesn't increase. We were interested in looking at some conditions that are perhaps more specific to the confined aquifer in the Kingston area. So obviously the fact that it's artesian makes it a very attractive resource for irrigation and whatnot. So we thought, well, we'll run the scenarios and see what impact they have on artesian conditions in the confined aquifer. So this is the scenario as I showed in the last slide. This is business as usual, so extraction from the confined aquifer at rates of between 9 and 14 gigalitres per year. As you can see, the pressure, the artesian pressure in the confined aquifer, which is represented by this coloured area, is generally maintained. This plot is at the end of the irrigation season, so in our simulation about February or March. Everything's artesian, bores should still be flowing. If we increase extraction in the model to 25 gigalitres per year, at the end of the irrigation season, we start to see that artesian pressure start to shrink in area. So some of these bores would potentially not be flowing under artesian pressure anymore because of that increased extraction. And then if we increase extraction to 40 gigalitres per year, we see almost complete loss of artesian pressure in the Kingston management area, which means those bores would not be flowing at the end of the irrigation season. Irrigators would have to start pumping, which would mean a change in business model. And this decline in artesian pressure is associated with a drawdown in the pressure surface of the confined aquifer of about 30 metres. Potentially, it could still be used as a resource by pumping water out of the aquifer, but what this also does is change that natural gradient between the two aquifers, so now there's the potential for downward leakage from the unconfined aquifer, which might have some longer term impacts on groundwater conditions in the area. So, yep, back over to Tim.
So, where we got to is that back in late February this year, we went and had a meeting with the Mid-South East irrigators and sort of presented these scenarios to them and said, when you look back at these different scenario outcomes, we're trying to get them to understand the situation they're looking at as their use might change over time. And for them, there's some quite strong economic drivers for them making decisions, because this is, as that zero head moves closer to the coast, it's affecting them directly by, rather than being able to use artesian water, they'll have to pump. There's also issues there with that leakage down into the confined aquifer of the unconfined aquifer, which is much, much more salty. And so there's a lot of economic decision making that has to go on there. So we're in the process now of providing them with access to the full report so they can read all of the scientific detail. So we've had a presentation, a Q&A session with them to get them familiar with the situation. But what we're planning to do is make sure that all the licensees in that management area are aware of the situation, have got access to the information, so that we can meet with them again in August during a quiet time of the year to have a bit more of a discussion about what options they might have for managing that resource, given that under the water allocation plan we've allocated around about 40,000 megalitres of water, and we've got a scenario that says their present use looks okay. If we go to our risk management level of 25,000 megalitres, we're going to start to have the need to pump at the end of the season, increase risk of leakage into the confined aquifer of saltier water. And if they go out to their full allocation, then they're looking at the prospect of having to pump most of the time, higher risks of salinity issues and all those sorts of things. We've got an opportunity to deal with this in that the water allocation plan for Low Limestone Coast has got a mid-term review program for 2019, and so that will give an opportunity to bring any options that we work out with the irrigators to the South East NRM board to look at whether we need to amend the water allocation plan to reflect how we sort of jointly think that long-term management of the resource should go. So I think that's it. Thank you.